Hey all, so I'm back with another glossary video. If you're new to this series, I'll link the playlist in the description, but basically the idea is to go over fundamentals of the game that may not always be spelled out in any centralized spot within the game. And today we're going to start getting into some of the meatier topics with something that I think is really the source of a lot of misunderstandings in this game, and that is damage types. So, in a broad sense, there are three kinds of damage in this game. Basically, everything that is done is energy damage, physical damage, or direct damage, which is neither of the other two. And that really is the core of how I process damage types, is that damage is either energy or physical, or it's not. And I really think of direct damage more as not being the other two than as being its own type, and we'll get to why. So then, as we get into examples, I think it's really important to note that any source of damage can be any damage type. And so what I mean by that is when you're thinking about your actual hits. So these are your usually white numbers if they're non-critical hits, yellow numbers if they are critical hits, or orange numbers if the champion is under the effect of a fury, right? But those are the three colors that characterize actually landing hits on the opponent. Those can be both energy and physical. On the physical side, you have most of these. So punches, kicks, bullets, thrown rocks, any of that. And then on the energy side, you mostly have the characters associated with energy. So a lot of mystics are like this: Claire, Purgatory, Diablo, a fair number of mutants like Havoc's medium blasts or Iron Man's beams. Any of those are energy. But what I'm getting at here is that this does not just mean that red numbers are always energy, which is something I see a lot. Because red numbers can be either from damage over time effects, so your bleeds, your poisons, your incinerates, your ruptures, or from immediate bonus damage, is how I tend to think of it. Whereas you land a basic or a special hit, and there is like a single tick of a red number on top of it, right? It's just really important to remember that red numbers do not equal energy damage automatically. Because this is a mistake I see a lot with people where you see something and it's like, oh, okay, this character or this node, this fight, has physical resistance, so I'm going to use Red Hulk because he has red numbers. Except Red Hulk's bonus damage is physical damage. Or if you head into something and you're using Apocalypse or Tigra and you're wondering why you're doing no damage even though you have all these red numbers, it's because it's physical damage, right? But it's also really important to keep in mind when that bonus damage is energy damage. If you've ever used, Black Widow Clairvoyant against Hyperion, and you're wondering why when you throw your special 2 in the Hellfire mode and it does all of that red damage, the numbers are smaller than you're used to, it's because Hyperion has energy resistance. So, just to reiterate, any source of damage can be any type of damage, so don't form strong associations there. The one exception that you'll see on this chart is that at the moment, all basic or special hits are typed as either energy or physical. There is nobody who, with their direct or with their like combos, does direct damage. Yet, anyway. I don't see any particular reason in the game why that wouldn't work, but it would be very powerful for reasons we'll get into. So I want to just address the asterisk on Bleed and Poison real quick. If you look at the descriptions of those abilities in the game or on Aunt Mai right now, it says that they do direct damage. It says bleeds the opponent, does this much direct damage over this many seconds for either of those. I'm only bringing this up because historically, those damage types often said did this much damage, ignoring physical resistance. I believe all of that has been updated in the game, but if we end up with a mirror champion to Bishop in the future who punishes taking physical damage, and Bleed and Poison seem to interact weirdly with that, It just wouldn't surprise me if there's something in the code that still has them typed as physical, but ignoring physical resistance on some level. Hopefully that's not true, and that's been fully updated, and they are just always direct damage, and so you can think of them alongside degen. But I just want to mention it in case that comes up in the future. So let's get into the main reason that all of this matters, which is that depending on what type of damage you are doing, your opponent might be taking more or less damage. And since the purpose of any given encounter in this game is normally to take less damage and do more damage, it's important to understand this. So we'll get into them a little bit more in a second, but just to lay out the categories, basically damage in this game is mitigated, is reduced through one of four mechanisms. You have armor, you have energy or physical resistances, you have protection, and you have mechanics that heal back damage. They don't actually prevent it, but they heal back a portion of what is taken. Think Sorcerer Supreme when she has her armor rune up and she blocks a special and regens some of it back, or Ultron's signature ability, when he takes energy damage, he instantly heals some of it back. So to dig into how exactly these work, armor works to reduce damage from basic and special hits. So it reduces all types of damage, but only from those white, yellow, and orange numbers. It's calculated when you take a hit, and if that hit is critical, it will ignore some of the armor. That's what it says in game. As best I can tell from various sources and research I've done, the critical hits reduce your armor rating by 20 percentage points, which means that whatever your armor is, or whatever your opponent's armor is fed through the diminishing returns calculation. Those flat numbers are turned into a percentage, and then that percentage is dropped by 20. This gets very complicated, so I'm not going to try and go through all of it right now, but I will say that feel free to ask for a clarification on a stream or something, and I will also point out that there are tools on the website Aunt Mai to help you process this. I will also be linking in the description an older forum post that goes into this in a bit more detail. But for now, we'll move on to resistances. So resistances reduce damage from all sources, but only of one type. So if your opponent has enough points of energy resistance to be translated in their sheet as 30% energy resistance, if you were to take 100 points of damage from an incinerate effect, you would reduce it by 30% down to 70 points, right? That's pretty simple. Incinerate is energy damage. 30% energy resistance reduces the damage of that incinerate by 30%. So where it gets a little bit more complicated is when it's not a damage over time effect, when it's not a red number, but when it's a basic or special hit, are white, orange, yellow numbers. Because in those cases, the flat values for armor and resistances are added together, then converted into a percentage reduction, and then that can be reduced by critical hits. So I know this is going to get complicated. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. But let's imagine that same character that has enough points of resistance for a 30% reduction in energy damage. Let's say that they also have 20% armor. So it might be tempting to think that that 20% plus that 30% means that if they get hit by a basic attack that should be doing 100 points of energy damage, that they'll reduce it to 50. But because of the way diminishing returns works in this game, it's more likely that instead of being a 50% reduction, it's probably going to be somewhere closer to, let's say, 45%. And so you would expect a non-critical hit against that character with 20% armor and 30% energy resistance. a non-critical hit with a base value of 100 energy damage would probably end up doing somewhere in the range of 55 to 60. And this gets even more complicated when you factor in challenge rating. So again, tabling that, we're just using these numbers as examples. So let's imagine that hit of 100 energy damage is actually a critical hit. And so that critical damage multiplier turns a 100 energy damage into 250 energy damage, let's say. So if we apply our same 45% reduction that we're working with from adding the armor and the energy resistance together, what you would arrive at would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 130, 140 damage, right? Because that is, without me actually doing the math, 250 reduced by a little bit less than 50%. But remember that critical hits bypass a certain amount of this reduction. And so if we are looking at an effective reduction of 45% between the armor and the energy resistance, the critical part is going to reduce that by 20%, bringing us down to about 25% reduction. In which case, our base damage on our critical hit of 250 energy damage is going to be reduced by a fourth to roughly 195 damage, right? I know that there are a lot of numbers involved here. There's a reason that this particular video does not have gameplay footage, because while you could see the numbers and see them change, this is just such a complicated area that I personally think it's easier to process in abstract hypotheticals like this. If this is not clicking right now, this just may be a video that you need to watch twice, and trust me, you're not alone. So that is, as best I understand, the fundamental interaction between armor and resistances when it comes to basic and special hits. Remember that I said armor does not apply to red numbers. And so no matter how much armor our theoretical character has, if they are being incinerated and they don't have energy resistance, it will not reduce the incinerate. Those are two different axes. So then let's talk about protection. Protection is something that I'm pretty sure is applied after everything else is calculated, after you figure out how much damage has been resisted by armor or resistances. Protection just goes to the end and says, all right, this is how much we reduce the amount after everything else is said and done. So the most obvious example of this is Thing's signature ability. When he has his rock stack, when he has 20 rock stacks and he's at Sig 200 and he procs his protection from his signature ability, he is reducing all damage by a total of basically 100%. And so he takes no damage at all. Doesn't matter what the armor and resistances are, doesn't matter if the opponent has True Strike to ignore those armor and resistances, doesn't matter if it's a critical hit, doesn't matter if it's a damage over time effect, doesn't matter if it's a burst of red numbers, it's just reduced by 100%. Protection is very, very powerful. That's also why you have to either be doing a lot of damage or you have to turn off those protection nodes in Alliance War or in content, because they're just going to reduce everything, right? This is also why Sasquatch, in particular, can be very dangerous on those protection nodes, because he has a protection mechanic in his kit. His rage stacks reduce damage from all sources by a certain amount, which stacks with those protection nodes. And so if you don't remove those nodes and Sasquatch's rage is starting to climb, you'll notice yourself doing very, very little damage. I'm also pretty confident that this is the step in which Spider Ham's Spider Nonsense comes in, because I have had fights in the past where the protection node is up and his Spider Nonsense is high, and my special attacks have done literally 0 damage, because you can tell that the Spider Nonsense and the protection are adding together. I believe that this is also the stage after armor, resistances, and modified attack are calculated, where taunt comes in, because whenever I've checked the math on taunt, it seems to just be, if it says it's a 50% taunt, then it is after everything else is calculated that it goes, cool, we're cutting the damage in half. The interaction between a taunt and a protection may be a little bit complicated, but again, Spider-Ham is quite good on these nodes because you have taunt, you have protection, you have spider nonsense. All of those reductions are at the very end of the calculation after you've looked at armor, resistances, critical hits, modified attack, etc. And a large part of that is because if taunt did not apply at the end like that, then modified attack would just get around it. Consider Killmonger, who is one of my favorite Spider-Ham counters. Let's say that Killmonger's base attack is 1000. If you have a max sig Killmonger, then when he has Reverb and True Strike up, his attack is being modified by, let's say, 1300. I forget the exact value. So instead of 1000, you're looking at 2300 total. If taunt only reduced base attack, if you're looking at a 50% taunt, then that would take that 1000 down to 500, but then you would still add the 1300, and you'd be looking at 1800 total. 2300 down to 1800 is much less of a reduction than 1000 down to 500, and so basically taunt wouldn't work very well on anyone who could modify their attack value. It wouldn't work very well if your opponent was running the recoil tree, if they were boosted, because all of those things modify attack. So it makes sense that taunt applies at the end here, but that also makes taunt very powerful, so just keep that in mind. So now that we've talked about all of those possible ways your opponent might be reducing your damage, how do you get through that? How do you make sure you're still doing enough damage to win the fight? So in general, you're looking at one of these methods. We talked about how if what's reducing your damage is armor or resistances to your basic or special attack hits, landing crits more often can be very good. Now, there are some champions that specifically nerf this, like Man-Thing does not take extra damage from critical hits. I believe the critical hits still bypass armor and resistances to a certain extent against him, but they do not then have their damage multiplied by critical damage values. This game gets very complicated when you start thinking about it this way. It's also worth noting that some characters punish guaranteed critical hits, like Nova takes less damage from guaranteed critical hits. Ebony Maw, unless you have class advantage, just causes them to miss, and so they don't do any damage to him at all. So watch for those mechanics. But this is one of the reasons that characters like Ghost, Corvus, just anyone with a high crit rate are so powerful, because if you are landing a ton of critical hits, then you are bypassing an awful lot of damage mitigation. You're shutting down a lot of your opponent's ways of slowing you down. So crits are very, very strong. You also want to take into account direct damage, because if your opponents have a lot of resistances, the best way to get by it is to use damage that is not filtered through resistances. This is why, after all this time since his release, Void is still one of the most reliable boss killers in the game, because his intimidating presence damage from the opponent having debuffs on them is all direct damage. It doesn't matter if you're facing a boss node that has 7 or 8 energy and physical resistance buffs each on your opponent, Void is still ticking away. If you were using somebody like, say, Hyperion, however, and you were hoping for your Incinerates off your special 1 to be doing a lot of damage, they would be getting blunted by that energy resistance. Void will not have that problem. This doesn't mean that Void is the best for all fights, but it is a reason that he has managed to be so timeless, because most of the ways in which this game slows down damage just do not apply to the primary way in which Void does damage. This is also why Black Cat is quite a good boss killer in certain matchups, because if you can start really triggering her sabotage damage over and over again, that is direct damage, and it bypasses those resistances. We also have to talk about True Damage, which is itself kind of incorporated in True Strike. Either of those abilities completely bypass armor and resistances. So anyone with true damage, such as OG Thor's special attacks, or true strike, such as Killmonger, Odin, Heimdall, any of those champions, they're just going to completely ignore any armor and resistances your opponents may have. They may not crit quite as often. That's something that they often do to balance true strike and true damage. But they don't need to crit as often because they're just ignoring those mitigating factors. This is why characters like Odin or Killmonger don't have quite as flashy a numbers in terms of damage, but it's just very consistent. Over time, they do a reliable amount of damage, and they just cut through their opponents. So True Damage and True Strike, both very powerful abilities. There are, again, mechanics in the game that punish both of those. Nova, again, reduces damage against True Strike. Spider-Man 2099 famously takes 75% less damage from True Damage or True Strike, which is why he's so broken against the boss node in Alliance War. There are a few other of these factors, but just keep in mind that in general, these are big strengths. They do have a few drawbacks. Because again, this game is complicated. So I have red numbers marked here with an asterisk because if you are dealing red numbers, you are bypassing your opponent's armor. Now, some red numbers are based on damage dealt. So if armor is reducing how much damage you're doing on your actual hits, and then the red numbers are being keyed off of that, you are still suffering a bit of a damage reduction. This is why, let's say, Red Hulk is not particularly good against Red Skull, who has a ton of armor, and for each armor reduces the opponent's crit rate, and so you're just not going to be landing crits to cut through that armor, and because you're not landing big hits, the red numbers that Red Hulk is doing aren't very big either. But if you are using somebody like, say, Tigra, where her red damage on inflicting a rupture has nothing to do with how much damage she is doing and is just based on how many debuffs are on the opponent, Tigra can absolutely shred Red Skull because she doesn't care how well armored he is. She doesn't care whether she's landing critical hits or not. She's just doing those red numbers reliably. So that's why that has an asterisk, because this is more about bypassing armor than it is about bypassing resistances. Like I said, you use Tigra against somebody with a bunch of physical resistance, it's gonna slow you down, but it's worth keeping in mind. And then I'm just calling out bleed and poison separately from direct damage here, not because I think they're meaningfully different. I believe that probably has been fully fixed, or it was always that way and they just updated the description for more clarity. Either way. But I think that these two effects are so old, we often don't think of them as explicitly direct damage the same way that we do Void or Degeneration or something like those. But this is why our Diablos, our Immortal Abominations, our Jabari Panthers, our Black Panthers, champions that can really apply a lot of bleed or poison, are some of the best damage dealers in the entire game, as long as your opponent isn't immune or highly resistant, because they get around all of these other resistances. So it's worth calling that out, because those are old abilities. I think they come across as kind of vanilla to some of us, but they're still very, very important for getting damage around other safeguards. So we've talked a lot about how these mechanics interact in this video, and hopefully that's provided some clarity. I know this is by far my longest glossary video thus far, but this topic kind of demands it. If from here your reaction is, okay, well, how do I know when I'm doing energy versus physical versus direct damage? How do I keep track of that? The simplest answer is to just read the kits of the champions you're dealing with. Because most of the time, it tells you. It will tell you, like, all of Diablo's basic attacks are energy damage. It will tell you, like, this is an incinerate, therefore it deals this much energy damage. Tigra's kit tells you that when she inflicts ruptures, she does physical damage. Apocalypse's kit tells you that the burst damage he does on specials is, again, physical damage. Those things are in the kit. They will also tell you whether those abilities just do a set amount, like with Apocalypse, whether it scales with base attack only, which is an important thing to keep in mind, like Mysterio's poisons only scale with his base attack, or whether it's based on damage dealt, like with Hercules or Red Hulk, so that you have to keep in mind, alright, I still need to do actual damage for my red numbers to get through. All of those things are in the kits themselves, and you should just probably know that about your favorite characters. For slightly more complicated things, like, okay, but which hits of a given character's special are energy versus physical damage? For weird things like, oh, so Mysterio's fourth light attack where he applies a heal block is energy damage, but the rest of his basics are physical? Those are the kinds of things where I go to Aunt Mai. I've talked about this basically in every glossary video thus far because it is just an invaluable resource. Thank you again to Duckslug for maintaining this site. It's awesome. But I will link that in the description as well, because if you're not sure whether something does energy or physical damage, look there first. Go down to where it lists the combos and specials of that champion at the bottom of the page, and it should tell you for most of them whether they are energy or physical, projectile, or contact. If you still have questions, then, as I've said a couple times in here, hop on a stream if I'm streaming, reach out to me on Twitter or something, I'll try and add some clarity. But in the meantime, I hope this has given you the tools to think a little more clearly about how and why different characters in this game are doing the damage that they are doing. This shapes who is good, where, and when, and it is just always something on my mind when I'm trying to evaluate character strengths. Hope you've enjoyed this. I am going to try and get back into a regular release schedule with these videos, so hopefully there'll be another one next Sunday. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and take care.